One of my personal favorite detail airbrushes available today is this model, the Creos PS-771. I originally bought this model in late 2019 or early 2020 after well over a decade of using custom microns. And so now, about 5 years later, this video is going to be my long-term review of the 771. And just a quick disclaimer before we start, I do not work with or for any airbrush brand or any paint company. And just so you know, I purchase every single product that I use, review, and showcase on this channel. So this video is not an advertisement and it's not a promotion for this brand. Let's start with the objective stuff here. This airbrush comes equipped with a 0.18mm needle and nozzle. It's a true detail airbrush designed for spraying very small, intricate work. It also has that micron-like head assembly, a design that goes back to Olympus airbrushes, and it's just always been one of my favorite designs for precision work. You probably noticed that on the front of the airbrush, just below the paint cup, is a small air valve. These are often referred to as MAC valves, which is a term from Iwata airbrushes. And MAC, M-A-C, is an acronym for micro air control. You can use this valve to adjust the airflow through the front of your airbrush. A very popular technique is to tighten this down so that a small amount of air is flowing through the nozzle, and then when you paint, you can pull off some stippling effects like what I'm doing here, just a bunch of small dots, not fully atomized paint. Now, I personally am not a huge fan of MAC valves just because I don't use them. I always have them wide open. But that, of course, is my preference. I know that a lot of people love them. This airbrush comes standard with a MAC valve. There's no way to buy one without it. The rear handle has a small cutaway, so you're easily able to access the needle chucking nut. If you'd like, you can use this to quickly flush out anything within the cup by pressing down on the trigger and then pulling all the way back on the needle chucking nut. This will fully open the nozzle and spray anything out of that paint cup. And at the very back of the airbrush is a needle limiter, and you could use this to preset the trigger distance if you'd like. You'll see that as I screw this down, it limits the distance that I'm able to retract the trigger. And the less that you pull back on the trigger, the less paint that the airbrush is going to spray. So it's always nice to see one of these. It's not a feature that I use personally, but it's nice to have that option on the airbrush. The PS-771 also comes with a large 10ml paint cup. That's about 1/3 of an ounce, so it holds a fair amount of paint. This paint cup is permanent, it's not removable, and it's the only option available for this model. When you buy this airbrush, it comes with the trigger that you're seeing here. It has that standard round pad on top, very comfortable to work with. And this model and all Creos airbrushes, to be honest, have one of the smoothest trigger actions that I've ever felt from any brand. Just an incredibly soft trigger, both to press down and to pull back. And when you combine that trigger action with the design of the head system, you just get one of the most responsive and precise detail airbrushes available today. And even though the trigger that comes with this model is incredible, I've really been a huge fan of this Iwata Micron trigger. I've been kind of hooked on it since they released it. I guess that was like 2013 on the version 2 Iwata Microns. And I've just been a huge fan of it ever since. It's just a bit taller than the old design, and it's wide and just gives you a ton of grip for that trigger finger. And because the Creos PS-771 is kind of like the little brother to the Iwata Micron, it fits this airbrush perfectly. But with that said, the trigger that comes with this airbrush is amazing. It's pretty much a perfect trigger. I only swapped it out because I had some extra parts from my Microns, and I figured since I had them, why not? But if I were you, if I just bought this airbrush, I would just use it stock. The trigger is amazing the way it comes. So from here, let's move along to one of the best things about this airbrush, and that's the build quality and the chrome coating. The only imperfection that I could find on this airbrush is right here along this weld. It has zero impact on the performance of the airbrush, but it is something that I noticed, so I wanted to point it out. But besides that, the finish on this thing is just incredible. It's one of the nicest built airbrushes that I own. And then when you consider the price of this airbrush, which I'll talk about at the end of this video, I'm not quite sure how they do it. It's just one of the nicest finishes I've seen from any brand at a really, really amazing price. And keep in mind that this airbrush is just about 5 years old. It's seen hundreds of hours of use, so it definitely has some micro scratches and some imperfections. But during that time, it held up beautifully, just as well as any of my Iwata airbrushes or my Harder and Steenbecks. Some of the chrome coating did wear off at the bottom of the paint cup, but that happens to every airbrush in time. Don't ever panic if you ever see some discoloration or worn chrome at the bottom of your paint cup. It will eventually happen to any airbrush the more use it gets. So from here, I want to show you all the internal components of this airbrush, so I'm going to do a quick breakdown here. After removing the rear handle and loosening up that needle chucking nut, I retracted the needle from the airbrush. And I fully removed that chucking nut, placed it to the side so I don't lose it. From here, you're going to see this screw, and this is called the needle spring adjuster. You could adjust that spring tension, meaning the feel of the trigger, by how far you tighten this down. And the threads are very thin, so you get a ton of very fine control. To remove this entire spring assembly, I'll unscrew this black component here called the spring guide. And you can see that once I unscrew that, we have the entire rear spring assembly here, which consists of 4 parts. There are some design changes, but this is nearly identical to what you'll see in Airbrush Custom microns. If I fully unscrew this needle spring adjuster, you can see that the spring will lift right out, and this is the entire assembly disassembled. We have the needle chucking guide with the trigger lever connected, which is bonus points in my book. We also have the spring guide, the needle spring, and the needle spring adjustment screw. I'll take that needle chucking guide and then place the spring guide over the top. Then I can insert that spring right over the needle chucking guide and then screw down the needle spring adjuster. This trigger spring assembly is one of the more complicated ones from any airbrush, but the good news is you're never going to need to remove this. I'll only take this apart every few years to clean it out if I notice that the trigger starts to get a bit sticky. And speaking of the trigger itself, in order to remove it, I want to make sure that that trigger spring assembly and the needle is removed from the airbrush. And then I'll just slightly lift it up, rotate it 90 degrees, and lift it right out of the top of the airbrush. It has that small bar on the bottom, just like you'll see from any other micron. And now you need to be very careful here because there is a small piston here that's sitting down in between that O-ring right underneath the trigger. This thing is very, very easy to lose, so just be aware that it's there. And of course, inside the body of the airbrush is the needle packing screw, which is adjustable. And at the front of the airbrush is the nozzle head assembly. I'm only going to remove the air cap here to show you the nozzle itself because on these micron head systems, it's so easy to damage these by messing around with them. This is just like what I talked about in the SOTAR 2020. You'd only need to remove this if something is broken or something got into the paint cup and clogged the nozzle. Otherwise, just keep your airbrush clean by flushing plenty of cleaner through it at the end of the day, and the nozzle is going to last you a very, very long time. And so that's it for the airbrush breakdown. Those are all the internal parts. Everything on this is exceptionally well made. The precision of all the individual parts, the way everything fits together, just feels incredible. It's an absolute premium airbrush. And even looking at the small individual parts, everything is just machined so nicely. It just shows that no corners were cut in the manufacturing of this airbrush. As I'm sure a lot of you guys know, I own a lot of airbrushes, and this one is without question one of the nicest ones that I own. So a few weeks back on the channel, I painted this monochromatic portrait as a tutorial. I started with a custom micron Takumi around the eyes, and then for the rest of the portrait, I switched off between the PS-771 and the SOTAR 2020. And the performance of the PS-771 is as close to perfect as you can get with any detail airbrush. I love the SOTAR 2020, it's one of my favorite airbrushes of all time, but with the PS-771, it has a slightly tighter spray pattern, so you don't need to be right off the surface to get small details. You can back up a little bit, it just feels a bit more comfortable. It also has that very nice low airspeed that I talked about and showed in my first review of the 771. And that just makes it so comfortable to paint with. So when I'm painting at a normal PSI right around 20, you don't really feel much turbulence blowing off the surface that you're painting. And then for the few times that I'm spraying an over-reduced paint at like 13 or 14 PSI, you can barely even feel the air coming out of the airbrush. It's just such a low airspeed and very little turbulence coming off the surface that it makes detail work so comfortable to do. If you own this airbrush or you own a custom micron, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the trigger itself is extremely responsive. It's just like all other Creos airbrushes that I've used in the past. Just the smallest movement of the trigger going back sprays paint, and it's at the same point every single time. And so that responsiveness, the way the airbrush sprays, starts, and stops the paint is just one of the best out there. If I write out letters in print like I'm doing here, it just starts and stops exactly where I want it to. Where it makes it so easy to do that it almost feels like you're drawing with a pencil, something that I just love. It's a large airbrush in the hand, there's no question about it, and it has some weight to it. And the feel of it in the hand is all going to come down to personal preference. I'm a relatively big guy. I'm just over 6'2", so I have larger hands and it fits my hands like a glove. It's just very comfortable to work with and to paint with. So as you can tell, I love this airbrush. I love everything about it. And one of the really great things about this is that it comes in at an amazing price. You can find it online from $170 to $180 US. When I bought this one, I paid around $225, which I thought was a steal at the time. And now I see it online, Amazon, Spray Gunner for like $170 to $180. I've even seen it go as low as $150 US, which is probably one of the best deals you can get today. But even at the price that I bought it for, I could not be happier with this airbrush. Well worth that price. And so that's going to be it for this long-term review of mine. It's just one of the greatest airbrushes that I own. I love the PS-771 so much that if I lost it, I would buy another one that day to replace it. It's always going to be one of my highest recommendations because to me, it's one of the greatest airbrushes of all time and one of the best you could buy today. So I do hope that this video was helpful to any of you that are interested in picking up this airbrush. And even though it's only been 5 years, it has not let me down at all during that time. And I fully expect it to last at least another 30 more. I want to say thank you so much for the incredibly kind and generous support of the current channel members. You guys really help keep this channel going, so thank you. I'd like to welcome Alexander and welcome back Thaga, Fernando, and Joby at tier 3s. It's very generous of you guys. Thank you so very much. I hope all of you have a great week. Best of luck in your paintings, and I will see you back here next Friday.